Thank you, Chair. Uh, we have talked a lot about strategic culture since morning, and this my title, "The Use of Force and War in the Arthaśāstra," has been automatically dealt with in other topics as well. Specifically, the paper presented on grand strategy, and most of the part what I'm going to present here has already been considered, taken, and as analytical tools. Well, before I go to the Arthaśāstra thought figures regarding use of force in war, I would like to delve into the philosophies that we have been talking since morning about the Advaita Vedanta and monism also, because I, at the very first instance here and in the beginning, would discuss about the ontology of force in the Arthaśāstra. Actually, that relates to the question, is war inevitable? And why do we use force? And why this is the last resort? These questions are to be found in the philosophies called Advaita Vedanta. And specifically when we talk about the Arthaśāstra, we have to look into the philosophy of Sankhya Yoga and Lokayat. That compositely or together, this lump of philosophies together creates the science of inquiry for the Arthaśāstra, clearly defined. And this is a bit of a theistic inquiry. Starts with speculation, who am I, and the nature of reality. God, not in terms of being a four-limbed human being, supreme in nature, but God as reality. As you know reality, you know God. If you want to know God, know the reality. There may be different perceptions of reality based on different cultures and the understandings of their own context, social, metaphysical, philosophical, whatsoever. Monism has given us, as Indians, the value of toleration, because that generates a kind of empathy towards the other, because you identify yourself in the other and the other in yourself also. But the paradoxical existence is paradoxical and contradictory in nature, in essence, the nature of being. That's why we also have to use force, and that is reflected in the philosophies of Sankhya and Yoga very clearly. Lokayat is definitely a positivist philosophy which has directly to deal with force and self-gratifications and all that. In Sankhya and Yoga philosophy, the human nature is discussed, and human nature is composed of the triguna, the sattva, rajas and tamas, which deals about the activities which produce perceived good and perceived bad effects. Force, of course, is categorized or kept in the category of the tamasic pravritti or tamas category. And to note this human nature, is constituted of these two, good and bad, perceived good and bad activities. Naturally or inherently, they are not as cause and effects of each other, good or bad activity kind of thing. Because when we look into the dominant understanding of human nature in the international relations itself, Hobbes and Locke, the human nature is initially or naturally assumed as good or bad. For some reasons, this has to be accommodative in nature after some time. But the Sankhya and Yoga philosophy find that these are inherent triguna in the in the elements of triguna, which are natural, and these qualities try to dominate each other at various points of time. That's why nobody is though everybody has elements of these two kinds of the qualities, and nobody can be devoid of it. So, good and bad dichotomy is not fine, not to be understood as we have taken it always, but good and bad has to be perceived contextually, and this always depends on from the point of our own understanding and situations where we see it. That's why dharma and force together, or the entities what we identify as good or bad, are there always, and we will have to deal with it to exist socially and look forward our own social and creational existence. This is the fundamental philosophy in the Arthaśāstra, that although looks forward on the basis of dharma for a creation of society that is just, but the element of force as an essentiality is recognized, and it defines it. The Arthaśāstra as a dandaniti also, because the science of Arthaśāstra is, in another terms, the science of the use of force, and here. And it's somehow okay. Yeah, he says that initially, to start with the text, he says that duties common to all are abstaining from injury, injury to living creatures, truthfulness, uprightness, freedom from malice, compassionateness, and forbearance. All these principles look like where is it? Yeah, look like the precept from the Dharmashastra, but actually this is in the Arthaśāstra. But it later says that the administration of the rod constitutes the science of politics, that is to say the Arthaśāstra, and therefore it's a balanced approach in consonance with the science of inquiry, that is Sankhya and Yoga and Lokayat. And he quotes that the means of ensuring the pursuit of philosophy, the three Vedas, and economics is the rod, danda or force. Its administration constitutes the science of politics, having for its purpose the acquisition of not possessed, the preservation, shema, of things possessed, and augmentation, that is vardhana, of things preserved, and the bestowal of or pratipadana of things augmented on a worthy tirthe, that is known as tirth, worthy recipient. And in fact, this is the basis of the whole strategic perspective taken by the Arthaśāstra. It talks about what's not acquired, protection of what's acquired, and looking forward for the distribution to rightful people, that is tirthe, worthy recipient. It's a whole kind of social philosophy of distribution of resources as well. But the administration of rod and force is important in this. When we look at a traditional perspective, Arthaśāstra is not only the text that has been written in India. There were others also, and why this has become so important depends on its success throughout in its use, and the others have gone irrelevant. And this is evident in the text itself, where he disagrees with the preaching teachers who seek that the king for orderly maintenance of worldly life should ever hold the rod lifted up. Means he should always be ready to use force for the orderly life and order in society. But he starkly differs from the other teachers and say that for the king, severe with rod becomes a source of terror to beings. The king mild with the rod is despised, and the king just with the rod is honored. This is the idea for the use of force and war in the Arthaśāstra. And he further says that for the rod used after full consideration endows the subject with spiritual good, material well-being and pleasures of senses. Used unjustly, whether in passion or anger or in contempt, it enrages even forest anchorites and wandering ascetics, who how much more than the householders. It means that the unjust use of force gives rise to Matsya Nyaya, which in fact is comparable with the state of nature given by Hobbes. But that is not the beginning. The Arthaśāstra begins earlier, and this Matsya Nyaya is a state in history. It's not a state at the beginning of history. It means that Matsya Nyaya is a historical state in human society where it prevailed. And the Arthaśāstra doesn't begin with that. Arthaśāstra treats it just as a stage in long history. That's the difference between the understanding of the East and West, if we can really dichotomize it. And the whole essence of Arthaśāstra is in avoiding Matsya Nyaya and establishing some kind of order. Matsya Nyaya is law of fishes, where the mighty dominates the weaker one. And to see how comprehensive Arthaśāstra's definition of force is, we can look at one of his statements, Kautilya's statement. He says that killing, tormenting and seizure of property constitute force. This is not only physical, it's non-physical as well, because tormenting and seizure of property is not directly related to use of force, physical use of force. This may be done otherwise. And therefore, the definition of force and for strategizing, not only hard power as we know is important, but also the non-physical aspects of power are important. That's the point. And he says that the king should take from the kingdom fruits as they ripen, not acquire with force. As from a garden, he should avoid unripe fruits that cause an uprising for fear of his own destruction. Because that is paradoxical. Paradoxical relationship has already been explained in the Sankhya Yoga philosophy. Means the relationship is paradoxical. The good and bad forces try to dominate each other at different points of time, and Matsya Nyaya is one such time where bad things are dominant. And therefore, to avoid all these things and just use of force, he suggests certain measures to be taken while training, and that's a kind of training to the king in self-discipline, as the rod rooted in self-discipline brings security and well-being to the living beings. Actually, he is looking for a suitable person. Somebody asked a question about democracy. How to do it in a democracy? If that is if a right person was to be selected, that was good for monarchical setups. But for democracy, how it's to be done? And yes, that we can extrapolate in terms of the qualities required for a person to be elected. And then that depends on the masses, how to bring that kind of people in the positions of ruling. The qualities important here for the person who was to be allowed to use force as king can directly be related to today's qualities which is required by a democratic leader also. And here these are very clear. For training discipline, suitable staff, not one unsuited. Unsuited people means people with not right qualities are not to be trained. Science imparts discipline to one whose intellect has the desire to learn, listening, retention, thorough understanding, reflection, rejection of false views, and intentness on truth, not to any person. Means impersonality is also important here. Whether for rulers, whether this is a democratic setup or a kind of monarchical setup. The force as last resort. The philosophy of Sankhya Yoga indicate that for existence, good deeds or sattvic gunas are required, and but because of the inevitability or innateness of the bad qualities or which are identified as bad forces like use of force are also there. That's why they will be revealing themselves in one or the other ways always. It's a kind of understanding of reality. We are not thinking in a linear term but existential terms. Linear history, we are not talking about that. Then for the existence of somebody or the emergence of sattvic guna in society, one has to rely first on those guna rather than the force. One should try to always put it at the back. And here that's why the order of Sam, conciliation, Dana, gift, Bheda, dissension and Danda, force. And he says clearly in this quote at the bottom that the Danda is always to be used at last while implementing any policy. Yes, this the preference of force to be used at last is reflected in his concept of Mantra Shakti, Prabhava Shakti, Utsaha Shakti as well. That is power of knowledge, power of treasury, power of valor. And preferring the use of Mantra Shakti or a Mantra Yodha, he has a nice quote here at the bottom when he says that an arrow discharged by archer may kill one person or may not kill even one, but intellect operated by a wise man would kill even children in the womb. Thus the kind of understanding Arthaśāstra or Kautilya has. The nice point here, and it was stunning to me, the state monopoly of use of force, very clear about. And he clearly says that people shall move unarmed except those permitted with a sealed license. Means it's a kind of a modern phenomena which we can find there even. What we call modern is even pre-modern in this text. The frontier officer should seize the weapons and armors of Karama traders or allow them to pass after selling them. Nobody has the right to use force except the state, and only the officials or the noblemen who are authorized and have license to use weapons may display or take them in public sphere. And there are different levels of the use of force also. It's a domestic level and the interstate level, external or internal, we can say that. For internal purposes of use of force, is because it's required to maintain order, the instruments of fine punishment and torture even has been used. Torture. The most modern theories of torture will say that the force must not at any cost be used to extract information and all. But Kautilya's, because his worldview is different from Sankhya and Yoga, he says that this is important. Torture is important, but he qualifies with conditions. That a person with so and so kind of history that is bad, and that is even if that is recurrent, not for the first time. And means even if there is a criminal who is by habit a criminal, he can be tortured in case if it is required. And even he cannot be, if he is a disabled man, if he is sick, if he is at the some adverse situations. But if he is a recurrent criminal, he can be tortured. And torture, then torture is not a policy and is prohibited in some cases, as for like women also. And means torture is to be used, but qualified with the conditions. The interstate, the use of force is for security and expansion or the promotion of the interest of the state. And the general principles of use of force that we have discussed earlier means applies at both the levels. And there are different ways of the use of force, secret and open also. When he talks about open warfare and Tushnim Yuddha, concealed warfare and all. But has always a preference to use of secret force or secret ways of use of force. He prefers special operations, and there is a caveat that the state should not in any case appear to be having a predilection for use of force. As we see in certain cultures that means there is a kind of raw display of force to appear strong state. That's not to be, and probably that's why India has a predilection to be seen as a soft state, but when requires it uses power and force. And preference to Mantra Shakti, Mantra Yuddha we have already discussed. The aim of war we see here is importance, is state interest, to serve state interest, not glory. And glory is glorified in the certain West cultures, if we call it Western culture. And he says that, ignoring earlier opinions, to fight in the name of Kshatriya valor when weak, fighting with only a small army perishes like one plunging in the ocean without a boat. Means this is not advisable at all. He, the king, should, however, act finding shelter with a king superior to him or in an unassailable fort. Means there is no harm in taking shelter and appear weak if you want to be seen as, and strategize accordingly, and no use of fighting for glory. The criteria is state interest. And the meaning of war is vigraha. Means vigraha is the term for war used in the Arthaśāstra. And vigraha is not to be used only for explicit use of force. Vigraha simply means hostilities as well. Means expressed hostility. It's not always hard power. It's not always hard power, but expressed hostility towards the other as well, that serves some purpose and serves some ends of the state. Means to strategize in terms even of grand strategy, he looks at other means and tools than the hard power as well. Hard power primarily. The non-ideological use of war, yes, there is no ideology to guide war, only self-interest. And the contextualized self-interest. And aim is to defeat the enemy state, not people. Meaning of victory is the submission of the enemy king, achieving the political goal. It's not routing the other countries or taking revenge of something. And there was not only qualitative measures to be taken in form of training the king or the ruler, but there was some hard, concrete and objective criteria also, on basis of which measures was to be taken for the use of just use of war, or the right amount of the use of war, proportionate use of war, and when to use war, when not to use war. These criteria which Ms. Kajri has already discussed in her paper that the Saptanga, the 7 elements of the state, the excellences of these elements are to be checked. They should be in their excellent health before going to war. The Shajgunya Niti, actually this is one of the longest chapters in Arthaśāstra, deals with various kinds of the strategies of use of force and war, and war and force always comes at a last resort in principle. Ways of war and victories, Dham Vijay, Lobha Vijay, Asur Vijay. These are the methods of Vijay, or the methods of warfare on which the various kinds of victories have been classified. And here you can see that the one ruler which can be satisfied with submission is Dharma Vijay, satisfied with seizure of lands and goods is Lobha Vijay, and Asura Vijay is the one who is satisfied only with seizure of land, goods, sons, wives and lives and all. There is an important aspect of the Arthaśāstra here, humanitarian aspects, use of force. The principles in these points look almost like Geneva Convention rules, that force is not to be used indiscriminately. There should be some judgment or qualifications to be made before the use of force against someone during combat. Tracing continuity is important. Yes, Kajri has already spoken my mind, because she is taking up a research in the draft nuclear doctrine, which I also feel like at first sight that this is a cultural expression of a kind. Why? Because I feel like there was, even India had not declared the first use policy, there was not going to be much of a change in the international situations and India's gains or losses. And that was India's own cultural mindset that it chose to express or declare its no first use policy to present itself in the light of its own dharma-oriented discourses. Conclusion is something, I'll just read 2-3 points. Force not as a policy, king not a soldier. King is always trained as a civilian and intellectual pragmatist or protagonist. There are qualitative and empirical assessment of force, that is important, and qualitative quantitative measures for the use of the right amount of force has been taken. The conclusion is that it is Arthaśāstra presents to us that it is difficult to use force against the just people. It's not always about the weakness or the strength of a king. It's always about, and he suggests to the weak king, and the quote is here, which says that the oligarchies also should thus guard themselves against deceitful tricks by single monarchs. And the head of the oligarchy should remain just in behavior towards the member of oligarchy, beneficial and agreeable to them, self-controlled and devoted men, and following the wishes of all. Means this is the disposition even a weak king can have to protect itself against a strong king. And force, brute force is not enough to overpower a weak king. And then he keeps on suggesting how a weak king clandestinely may use some tricks and instruments of force, that is special operations and secret use of force against the stronger one as well. But if he is a good governor at house and he is just towards his people, simple brute force cannot win him. This is the actual essence of the Arthaśāstra view on force. That's to end. Thank you.